A few years ago, I was really into camping alone. When I was younger, I used to go on trips with my friends, but as we all got older, they became harder to pin down, and trying to plan a trip that worked for everyone became nearly impossible. Eventually, I gave up on coordinating with them. The problem was, I still had the urge to camp. Out of everyone in my group, I was the most passionate about it and had gathered a bunch of camping equipment that was just sitting there unused. So I decided to give solo camping a try. At first, I was nervous, unsure if I'd enjoy it or if it would feel too lonely. But after my first trip, I was completely hooked. I loved the flexibility, being able to leave whenever I wanted, set up camp wherever I felt like, and do whatever I pleased without waiting on anyone else. If I felt like heading out after work on a Friday, I did. If I wanted to take an early morning hike, I could. If I preferred to eat dinner earlier or later than usual, no one was there to object. That freedom was addictive. I went as often as I could, at least twice a month. I had a method for picking my spots. I researched parks that allowed camping but avoided the crowded areas. I preferred to hike a couple of hours in, ensuring I was surrounded by nature with as few people as possible. Some of the places I visited were absolutely stunning. Over time, I perfected my camping setup, just enough gear for a weekend while keeping things light enough for a long hike. But I'm not here to talk about my gear. I want to tell you about the last time I ever camped alone. That day, I reached the park in the early afternoon after driving for a little over an hour. I parked my car in the designated lot and gathered my gear before setting off on foot. After hiking for about 2 hours, I found a spot that felt just right. There was still plenty of daylight left as I set up my camp. Once my small tent was pitched, I started gathering firewood. By the time I got a fire going, the sun had already begun to set. I ate a meal I had brought along and sat by the fire, sipping whiskey from a flask, enjoying the quiet of the wilderness. Feeling worn out from the day, I decided to turn in a little earlier than usual. I climbed into my tent and read for a while before drifting off to sleep. I must have been out for a few hours when I woke up suddenly to the sound of snapping branches and what seemed like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I held still, listening closely, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing by. But then, I heard the noise again. Footsteps, but this time from a different direction. Straining my ears, I realized something unsettling. There were 2 distinct sets of footsteps approaching my tent from different angles. Worse still, they didn't sound like the movement of animals. They were deliberate human steps making no effort to be quiet. Panic set in. My gut told me something was very wrong. First of all, no one should be out here in the middle of the night without a flashlight. And second, what were the odds of 2 people, coming from different directions, heading straight for my camp? I had to act quickly. I grabbed my handgun and the few essentials I'd need if I had to run. As silently as possible, I unzipped my tent and slipped out, moving in the opposite direction of the footsteps. I put as much distance between myself and my campsite as I could before crouching behind a dense cluster of bushes. From there, I watched and waited. Even though I had my gun, I wasn't the type to use it unless I absolutely had to. I carried it mainly for self-defense against wild animals. But now, I had a sinking feeling that humans were the real danger. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, in the dim moonlight, I saw movement near my tent. A shadowy figure emerged from the right, and soon after, another figure appeared on the left. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were definitely carrying something heavy, perhaps makeshift weapons. They paused, seeming to communicate, though I couldn't hear if they were speaking. Then, to my horror, they both raised their weapons in unison and began savagely beating my tent. Again and again, they struck the fabric, right where I had been sleeping just minutes earlier. I didn't stick around to watch. Their intentions were clear. I turned and ran as quietly as I could, fueled by pure adrenaline. They were making so much noise destroying my tent that they didn't hear me slipping away. Soon, I could hear them shouting and laughing, clearly pleased with themselves. I was beyond terrified, but I knew I had to stay focused. I was lucky to have a good sense of direction. I knew the way back to my car, even in the dark. I ran most of the way, only slowing to a fast walk when I couldn't keep up the pace. It took me around an hour, maybe an hour and a half, before I finally saw my car in the lot. The sight of it nearly made me collapse in relief. The rush of fear that had kept me going started to wear off, and my body began shaking uncontrollably. I forced myself to get inside and drive a safe distance away before stopping to catch my breath. Only then did the full weight of what had happened hit me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized just how close I had come to losing my life. By the time I had calmed down enough to think straight, the sun was beginning to rise. I called the authorities and reported what had happened. The police and park rangers searched the area, but they never found the two people who had attacked my tent. And that was the night that made me swear off solo camping forever. In a remote region of East Africa, I was jolted awake by the deep, resonating roar of lions, their calls answered by distant elephants. Nothing awakens the most primal part of your mind like hearing a lion's roar close by. I crawled out of my tent to find my tracker and guide, Juma, already tending to the fire. He had built it higher, flames keep them at bay. A short distance away, another camper was alone in his tent. As I sat near the fire, I saw his tent begin to shift. The zipper rasped open, and suddenly, he bolted at full speed toward his vehicle, parked roughly 50 feet away, diving inside and slamming the door. It was almost amusing at the time. At sunrise, I counted over 30 lions lounging near our campsite. You have to understand, this place was dangerously close to where the infamous man-eaters of Tsevo had hunted over a century earlier. In 1898, two massive, maneless male lions, one dark, one pale, systematically hunted and killed 135 railway workers. The film The Ghost and the Darkness tells their story, but Hollywood softened the truth. The real events were far more horrifying, and they weren't the first. I had spent hours unable to sleep, listening to their roars rolling through the darkness. My girlfriend thought I was out of my mind for sitting by the fire instead of hiding in the tent. Eventually, she climbed out, mumbling that she had to use the bathroom. The only option was a dilapidated old building at the edge of the camp. I asked Juma if it was safe, and he simply shrugged. I gestured toward the axe he used for chopping firewood. "If they come for you," he said, "an axe won't help. Let go fast and stay quiet." I was 23, halfway around the world, and had already faced some wild situations, but this was something else entirely. The walk to the structure felt like a nightmare safari. The thorn barriers meant to keep predators out had clearly failed. Frightened animals darted in and out of my flashlight's beam. A gazelle, a wildebeest, even a mother giraffe and her calf, taller than me, thundered past. Somewhere in the dark, something massive crashed through the undergrowth. Then, a sudden explosion of sound. An elephant trumpeted in fury, and a lion roared in agony. Had the elephant stomped a lion? I don't know how else to describe the sheer violence of that sound. We reached the structure, a long, narrow, decaying building. There was no electricity, no hum of a generator, just absolute darkness. I latched the door behind us. The silence inside was suffocating, the only sounds coming from the wild symphony outside. The interior had once been painted a dark green, now peeling and faded. A worn path cut through the middle, leading deeper inside. The bunk beds were long gone, salvaged, or destroyed. My girlfriend disappeared into the bathroom while I stood there, listening. Then something shifted. A soft thump, a faint scratching sound. The noise came from the far end of the building, and my adrenaline surged. I pulled out my camping knife. The toilet flushed, and my girlfriend muttered something about the faucet not working. She opened the door. "Why is your flashlight off?" I had forgotten to turn it back on. Flicking it on, I scanned the room, but something felt wrong. "I heard something," I told her. She froze. We both agreed it was time to leave. Halfway back through the building, she suddenly grabbed my arm. "Was that there before?" I turned my light to where she pointed. Streaked along the wall were smeared, bloody handprints, low to the ground, fingers together, tilted at unnatural angles. They hadn't been there before. They weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. A cold wave of dread settled over me. This wasn't a place for pranks. This was deep in the wild, where you could die from lions, poachers, snakes, or 1,000 other dangers. We hurried to the door, my small flashlight barely illuminating the path forward, the bloody handprints and endless blackness at our backs. Outside, the chaos of the lions was almost a relief. Back at camp, I hesitated before asking Juma if anything out here was haunted. He didn't even glance up from the fire. "Spirits, good and bad, are everywhere," he said. "Don't be surprised when you see things you don't understand." A few hours before dawn, the lions finally fell silent. I managed to get some sleep. In the morning, we packed up and left. But before we did, we counted one final time 38 lions. An almost unheard of, massive pride. Those handprints. Maybe one day I'll return. I also once camped solo on a secluded beach in Northern California, miles from civilization. Towering cliffs loomed over the roaring ocean. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet something about the place felt wrong. I've spent time in many remote locations, even grew up on the northern coast near San Francisco, but this was different. On my way in, I passed a couple hiking out. They seemed ordinary. We exchanged a quick greeting, nothing more. I spent 3 days there and saw no one else. A week later, the news reported that 2 campers had been found in their tent, decapitated in their sleep. The news showed the location. It was almost exactly where I had camped. I don't know if it was that couple I passed. I don't know who did it. And as far as I know, no one was ever caught. Back in 2004, my partner and I were living at his mom's house. Most days, we'd get home from work around 5 p.m., change clothes, and head out to explore a forested area in the hills just outside our town. For context, these woods stretched about 13 miles long and 3 miles wide, with breaks of farmland and fields dividing them into separate wooded areas with different names. Winding paths ran through most of the forest, making it possible to hike across the hills from one end to the other. The particular section we always visited was called Wrenwood Forest. Nearly every evening after work, my partner and I would take our usual route through the woods, walking and chatting about our day while sometimes enjoying a smoke. There was a circular trail looping around a dense grove of trees, surrounded by even more trees on the outskirts. From above, it probably looked like a messy donut. As we followed the path back up toward the top of the woods, where all the trails met before leading down to the parking lot, we noticed a man in the distance. He was walking down from a different path that led further into the forest beyond Wrenwood. We still had a bit to go before reaching the trail junction, but even from a distance, something about him gave me a bad feeling. The first thing that struck me as odd was his footwear. He was wearing dress shoes while carrying a pair of hiking boots, as if he had been walking through the woods but hadn't actually worn them. My partner and I quietly laughed about how strange that was as we continued walking. The man was moving downhill faster than we were going uphill, so he reached the trail junction a few minutes before we did. However, we lost sight of him for a while. When we got closer, we saw him just standing there, looking around. He didn't appear lost. He seemed like he was waiting for something. By this point, both my partner and I felt uneasy. We debated turning back and taking a longer route to avoid passing him. However, we realized that might look suspicious, as he had clearly seen us approaching. If we suddenly turned around, it could make us seem nervous. So we decided to keep walking up toward him. As we got closer, I noticed something even more unsettling. He was wearing a backpack, and sticking out of it was the handle of what looked like either a hammer or an axe. Couldn't have been anything else. Adding to the strangeness, he hadn't been using a phone at all during the entire time we observed him, not even while he was just standing there. We had no choice but to walk past him to get to the parking lot. As soon as we did, the man, without pulling out a phone or compass, suddenly seemed to know where he needed to go and started walking behind us. At this point, we were genuinely scared. Even my partner, who usually doesn't get paranoid, was visibly tense. I tend to worry over nothing, but this time, something felt truly off. There were no other cars in the parking lot, meaning he had no reason to be heading in that direction. We walked as fast as we could without outright running. It felt like it took forever, But we finally reached our car, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as we could. Jump forward to just last week. My partner and I were at a friend's birthday gathering, hanging out and meeting new people. As often happens during late-night small gatherings, we started sharing creepy stories and weird experiences. Naturally, we shared our unsettling encounter with the strange man in Wrenwood Forest. Two of the women at the party, who worked at a nature reserve called Fenwood Park, a different part of the hills we used to hike, were visibly shaken by our story. They told us they had a terrifying story of their own that would make ours even worse. One evening, Emily, one of the women, was closing the cafe at Fenwood Park with her manager. After finishing up, her manager told her he could handle the last few tasks alone, so she was free to leave early. Not one to argue, she went to her car, sat for a bit to unwind, and had a smoke before heading home. Later that night, she received a cryptic text from her manager. "Don't ask, just don't come to work tomorrow." The next day, she found out that after she had left, her manager finished closing up and walked to his car. As he got in, a man suddenly emerged from the woods and tried to wrestle him, attempting to steal his keys. Fortunately, the manager fought him off, got into his car, and drove away before calling the police. The police later connected this attack to a series of events from that same evening. Earlier, a resident in a village a few miles away had reported a possible break-in at their neighbor's home. That same night, a psychiatric hospital in town, on the opposite side of the woods, reported an escaped patient. As authorities pieced everything together, the horrifying truth came out. The escaped man had first gotten a haircut, then walked miles to an isolated village, breaking into what he assumed was an abandoned house. However, it was actually home to an elderly couple. The husband was disabled and confined to a wheelchair, with his wife as his caretaker. The intruder attacked and killed the elderly woman, leaving her husband alone and helpless in the house before wandering into the woods, looking for someone with a car to steal. That's when he ended up at Fenwood Park, attempting to take Emily's manager's car. After that failed attempt, he disappeared into the woods again. My partner and I are certain that this was the same man we saw acting suspiciously in Wrenwood Forest all those years ago. The timeline of events lined up perfectly. When we encountered him, it would have been shortly after his failed carjacking attempt at Fenwood Park. The next day, police finally caught him wandering in the woods. Looking back, I believe he was following us, but he wasn't planning to attack us in an open space, especially since there were two of us and one could have easily run to the road. Instead, I think he was trying to scare us into going back into the woods, where he would have had a better opportunity to ambush us. The way he lingered at the trail junction, watching us, now feels like an intentional attempt to unnerve us into making the wrong decision. Even now, this memory sends shivers down my spine. I'm just grateful that we made it out safely to tell the story. I worked as a specialist for the Regional Forestry Department, tasked with mapping fire breaks, fuel density, and flame movement using a drone equipped with infrared and LiDAR. My job involved being flown to high vantage points above active wildfires, where I'd set up my gear, gather data, and wait for a helicopter to pick me up. After a few days, I settled into a routine, or as much of one as possible when your ride hovers just enough for one skid to tap a rocky ledge while you jump out, trying not to break a bone. Then came the fun part, grabbing a 70-pound case of equipment before it slid off the edge. That morning, though, something felt off. I was dropped onto a razor-thin ridge, barely 3 feet wide, with a sheer 1,000-foot drop on both sides. Below me, the whole mountainside was ablaze. The fire had surged overnight, filling the air with thick smoke and blistering heat. Still, I got to work, flying the drone, mapping the area, packing up and calling in my ride. I heard the helicopter coming, but I couldn't see it. For 10 minutes, I listened as it drew closer, then drifted away. Finally, the pilot radioed in, "We can't land. Too much smoke. No visibility at the pickup or alternate spot." Then came the gut punch. "If you head northeast, the fire's less intense there." That's when it hit me. I was a 62-year-old cancer survivor, missing part of a limb, standing alone on a burning mountain with 70 pounds of gear strapped to my back. I was too old for this. But I had no choice. I had to haul myself and over $50,000 worth of equipment through an active wildfire. So that's what I did. For the next 4 hours, I was convinced these were my last moments. Trees collapsed around me, burning branches rained down, setting my clothes on fire. Every few steps, I had to drop and roll in the dirt to put myself out. I got burned, battered, and choked on smoke, but I kept going. Eventually, a team of firefighters spotted me and guided me to a clearing where the helicopter was waiting. I spent 2 days in the hospital with severe smoke inhalation and more burns than I could count. Scars from every moment I wasn't fast enough to put out the flames. That was my last wildfire. I had the privilege of saying, "Nope, I'm done." But the people who choose to fight these fires every day, they're built different, fearless in the best way possible. And they have my respect forever. Each year, my buddies and I take our families deep into the wilderness for our annual camping trip. A place so isolated you could shout for hours and no one would ever hear. No cell service, no roads for miles, and at least 200 kilometers from the closest hospital. It was a tradition, something we counted down to all year long. A chance to unwind and feel safe, surrounded by people we trusted. Until the year we made the mistake of bringing an outsider. One of my friends invited a coworker to come along. At first, he seemed all right, but the second we got there, something about him felt off. He was trying too hard, too eager to fit in, too quick to crack jokes about violence, weapons, and fighting. The kind of guy who always needed to prove how tough he was. That first night, we were sitting around the fire, drinking and telling stories, when the new guy started getting loud. First, it was just awkward, cringy jokes. Then it turned into personal insults. Then, full-blown hostility, like he was itching for a fight. When someone finally told him to shut his mouth, he lost it. He lunged at one of our guys, swinging wildly and screaming like a maniac. He hit the dirt almost immediately, but instead of backing off, he made the worst decision of his life. He reached for his gun. I was on my feet before I even had time to think. My rifle was up, 2,000 lumens of tactical light blinding him, my entire body coiled tight, ready. One more move and his skull was going to be part of the scenery. "Hands up, or I'll put a hole in your head," I growled. His entire body locked up. The fury drained from his face in an instant, replaced with pure, animal terror. His hands shot into the air as his voice trembled. He started mumbling apologies, calling me his friend over and over, as if that would somehow save him. In that moment, he knew, without a doubt, that he had come within seconds of dying. We stripped him of every weapon, his pistol, his knives, even a damn hatchet, chucked them to the far side of camp and made it crystal clear he was done. The trip was over. We shoved him into his car and told him not to move until we were long gone. I was so pissed I didn't even drive home that night. I found a cheap motel in the nearest town and tried to cool off, still fuming that my one trip of the year had been ruined. By morning, I figured I'd at least salvage the weekend, maybe head back and make sure he was gone. When I got there, the campsite was empty, his car, his gear, his weapons, everything gone. Except for one thing. Right where his car had been, sitting alone in the dirt, was a single pair of white underwear. And they were absolutely packed to the brim with feces. The guy had been so scared, so completely broken in that moment, that he had literally crapped himself. To this day, I still laugh about it, and we haven't invited a single new person since. Back when I was around 12 or 13, one of my school friends lived in a more rural area. It's difficult to describe exactly. While we were in the suburbs, his neighborhood was a bit farther out and had a more countryside feel. This was about 27 years ago, and I have no clue how it looks now. I used to visit his place occasionally for sleepovers because there was always some adventure to be had around his home. One day, he told me about some caves near his house, old mining tunnels to be exact. They were located in a large nature reserve. I was immediately intrigued and eager to check them out with him. We planned to go the following weekend, so I stayed at his house the night before, and we set off early the next morning. That weekend, We headed out at about 7:30 a.m. On the way, we stopped by a convenience store to grab some snacks and drinks before making our way to the caves. The nature reserve was enormous and stunning, with the perfect weather for hiking. Not too warm or too chilly, and the sky was bright and clear. After about 20 minutes of hiking, we came upon our first cave. We pulled out our flashlights and stepped inside. This one wasn't very long. It led to a small chamber where, at the far end, there was a heavy metal gate secured with a sturdy lock. My friend explained that some tunnels were sealed off due to the risk of collapses or flooding. Since the cave wasn't too deep and some sunlight still reached inside, we took a short break, ate a little, and just enjoyed being out in nature. Normally, I wasn't a morning person, but this was an exception. After finishing our snacks, we continued exploring and came across several more caves. Some were a bit longer, with signs that people had used them. Things like melted candle stubs, beer cans, and messy graffiti. But for the most part, the caves were relatively undisturbed, and visitors seemed to clean up after themselves. About an hour and a half into our adventure, we stumbled upon a tunnel that stood out. It was longer than the others, but it had barely any signs of human activity inside. As soon as we stepped in, I felt an odd sense of unease. It was strange because none of the previous caves had made me feel this way. I glanced at my friend, but he seemed completely fine, so I stayed quiet, not wanting to seem like a coward. At the far end of the tunnel, we found a metal gate similar to the others. However, this one was not locked. In fact, as we approached, it creaked open slightly, though I didn't feel any wind. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and the hairs on my arms stood up. It almost felt as if the tunnel was inviting us in. Without hesitation, my friend said, "Let's go." I was caught off guard by his excitement. How was he not sensing something was off? But I kept my concerns to myself, figuring I was just being paranoid. I regret that now. We stepped inside. The darkness was overwhelming. Our flashlights barely illuminated more than a few steps ahead. The tunnel stretched far into the distance, with no signs that anyone had been there recently. "What do you think we'll find?" my friend whispered. "No idea," I muttered. But by then, my uneasiness had escalated into full-blown dread. I felt slightly nauseous, and then it got worse. A breeze started to swirl around my ankles. At first, I ignored it, but then I realized, where was this wind coming from? The air seemed to grow colder with every step. Then I felt something brush past my shoulder and face. My heart pounded so hard I swore the sound echoed through the tunnel. And then whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs surrounded me. I froze in place and strained to listen. The moment I stopped moving, the whispers stopped too. Then, the most terrifying sound I had ever heard echoed from the depths of the cave. It started low but quickly grew into an ear-piercing scream. First a single voice, then several. Panic gripped me as I suddenly felt invisible hands grabbing at me. I snapped. I turned and bolted back toward the entrance, running as fast as I could. My flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted, making it difficult to see. Sharp rocks scraped my arms and legs, but I didn't care. It felt like I was running forever, but at last, I reached the gate, only to slam straight into it. It had somehow shut behind us. Frantically, I fumbled with the latch, struggling to get it open. My hands trembled, but finally, it swung toward me, and I stumbled out. My friend was right behind me, and together we ran without stopping. We didn't slow down until we were far away from the cave, gasping for breath. I was so overwhelmed that I ended up throwing up all over myself. To make matters worse, I only had one shirt for the weekend. My friend lent me one of his while we secretly tried to clean mine, for some reason convinced we'd get in trouble if anyone found out. Just before we left the area, I glanced back at the cave. It was instinctive, I wasn't even thinking, and that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure stood deep within the tunnel, watching us. I turned to my friend, and his pale face told me he saw it too. My stomach churned again, but I forced myself to keep it down. Without another word, we hurried away. That was more than enough excitement for one day. We returned about a year later, feeling braver and more grown up. But that particular cave, it had been sealed shut, reinforced with thick locks and warning signs about heavy fines for trespassing. Probably for the best. Looking back, I realize how reckless we were. Teenage overconfidence can lead to some seriously bad decisions, and we might not have been so lucky a second time. The first time I took my now wife backpacking, it was supposed to be an easy trip. We followed tracks from a large animal, likely a mountain lion, all the way in wasn't anything special, but it was tough to tell how recent the tracks were. They seemed to lead up the trail, heading away from us. We set up our tent, listening to the soft rhythm of rain hitting the fabric, and eventually drifted off to sleep. We should have paid more attention to those tracks. Something had been watching. By morning, something felt off. The ground outside was covered in mountain lion prints. Every inch of dirt was marked. The rain had erased our own footprints, leaving only a single set, and they circled our tent. That thing had been there all night, observing us, inching closer. You could see where it had pressed its nose against the fabric, sniffing where our heads were. First on my side, then on hers. And yet, through the night we heard nothing. Not a rustle, not a breath. That thing had been just feet away, and we never even knew. We packed quickly. As we hiked back, we spotted 2 fresh sets of tracks, one big, one small. The cougar had never left. It had followed us in. It was following us out. Silent, patient. Years later, we returned. This time, it was bears. 2 black bear cubs played near the trail, climbing, tumbling, chasing each other. There was no sign of their mother. We watched for a while. They were so close that we could see their tiny claws gripping the bark and hear the soft puffs of their breath as they wrestled. I rested my hand on my revolver, just in case, and we started moving again, speaking loudly so anything nearby would hear us coming. Then my wife stiffened. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She's right there." I followed her gaze. The mother bear was tucked away in the trees, barely visible in the brush. We were right between her and her cubs. I gripped my gun tighter, heart hammering. If she charged, we were finished. No running, no sudden moves, just keep walking. So we walked, we talked, we pretended not to see her, and she stayed still, only her head shifting slightly, tracking us, deciding if we were a threat. Step by step, we put distance between us. Finally, I risked a glance back. She was still there, still watching. And then, just like that, she went back to foraging. I let out a shaky breath and put my gun away. My pulse was still racing. That was the closest I had ever been to needing it. And yet, animals still don't scare me nearly as much as people. I was out camping with some buddies at the Lakeview Reservoir, just off Route 9 in the northern part of the state. It was after Labor Day, a weekday, which meant the place was practically deserted. So empty, in fact, that it felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves. After a few great days, we packed up to leave, but I decided to take one last hike before heading out. At the dead end of the road, near some closed-off trails and a rough, rocky path meant for off-road vehicles, I hiked down to a secluded pond. It was calm and quiet, just me and nature. But on my way back up, I wasn't alone anymore. Standing dead center in the trail was a man, older, maybe in his late 50s, but strong-looking with white hair. I greeted him, but he didn't move. The only thing he said was that he was waiting for his group to get past some boulders in their Jeep, which was parked about 50 feet up the hill. That's when I noticed another guy, much younger, probably mid-30s, watching me from near the Jeep. The older man glanced at my backpack, noticing the stitched-on name, a German surname. He grinned way too wide. "Hey kid, he's with us. Show him," he called out. The younger guy, Junior, as the older man had called him, lifted his shirt. Across his stomach were 2 huge, intricate tattoos. I forced a small nod and a quick smile, not reacting, not engaging. The older man started talking, mostly about guns, how they had been shooting all morning at some remote campsite. Meanwhile, Junior climbed back into the Jeep, slowly rolling it forward. The older man stepped closer, guiding his son around the rocks, and I took my chance. I muttered some excuse, turned up the hill, and walked away. Fast. That's when I spotted 2 more jeeps, both packed with men. As I passed, I gave them a quick, forced nod. But this time, no one nodded back. They just stared. I didn't run, but my pulse was hammering. I kept moving, feeling their eyes drilling into my back the entire way. The second I reached my car, I jumped in and got the hell out of there. I never saw them again, but the whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that, in the middle of nowhere, I had narrowly escaped something very, very bad. It was meant to be a peaceful and fun camping trip, just 2 couples heading out for a weekend getaway. We chose a remote spot in Pine Hollow National Park, not far from Millstone. I had found the location on a free camping website, a hidden treasure tucked at the bottom of a deep canyon. The road down twisted through steep switchbacks for nearly an hour before we finally reached the base. There were 2 campgrounds along the river. The first one was packed, while the second was completely deserted. That should have been the first warning sign. We set up camp in a spot between the dirt road and the river, with a thick patch of sagebrush separating us from the water. Right away, something felt strange. Near the fire pit, we discovered an old-fashioned rat trap, metal, vicious-looking, and oddly tied to the grill over the fire pit with a piece of rope. Strange, but not alarming. Then, down by the river, we found clothes draped over a log. Underwear, socks, pants, and a shirt. It looked like someone had left them to dry, but there was no one around. We figured maybe a hiker had gone for a swim and would come back for them later. Shrugging it off, we carried on with our evening. As the sun set, we settled around the campfire, relaxing with some drinks. It was about 9 p.m. I sat with my back to the river, facing my friend, who was looking toward the water. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, steady, and deliberate. They were coming from behind me, near the riverbank. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Before anyone could answer, the footsteps suddenly broke into a full sprint. Boots pounding through the brush, charging right at us. We leapt to our feet. I still had my axe in hand from chopping firewood, and without thinking, I raised it and shouted. And just like that, silence. The footsteps stopped immediately. We grabbed our flashlight and aimed it toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The brush wasn't rustling. There were no signs of an animal or a person, just the crackling fire and our own breathing. We stood frozen, scanning the darkness for what felt like forever. 10 long minutes of waiting for something to happen. Then a stick snapped. Not off in the distance, not randomly. It was close, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight just out of sight. That was enough. We didn't bother packing up properly. Just threw everything into the van as fast as we could. No hesitation, no second guessing. Just get out. Whatever was out there, I don't want to know. I've been camping all my life. I know what animals sound like at night. I've heard coyotes howling and deer crashing through the underbrush. This wasn't an animal. It was a person, and they were waiting for something. I'm just grateful we never found out what. This story, unfortunately, is true. I grew up in the Pinecrest Range, a breathtaking area filled with towering evergreens, rugged cliffs, and clear blue lakes. While I was never much of a camper, I spent a lot of my weekends as a kid hiking with family and friends and floating on the lake during the summer. The year I turned 17, nearly a decade ago, my cousin Mia came home after her first year of college, bringing along her boyfriend, Alex, who wanted to meet her loved ones. Like most visitors, Alex was eager to go on a scenic hike with a view of the lake. Mia and I decided to take him on one of our favorites, a moderate trail that weaved through the woods and led to an opening in the trees with a stunning overlook of Clearwater Lake. Alex had some hiking experience, though mostly in flatter areas, so we figured this hike would be a fun challenge while giving him the views he wanted. The trail was a round trip, taking around 2 to 3 hours up and the same amount back. Smaller paths branched off along the way, offering either steeper climbs or meandering routes down to the water. We set off early on a Saturday morning during his visit. The path wasn't the easiest to find, but it was well loved by locals since it offered solitude from the usual tourist crowds. At the time, it was mislabeled on popular hiking websites, so unless you knew where to look, it was tricky to locate. We passed only a handful of other hikers, mostly outdoorsy couples with hydration packs and dogs trotting alongside them. We reached the summit in good time and unpacked our lunches, enjoying the incredible view. Alex was completely in awe, snapping tons of pictures between bites of his sandwich. About an hour into our rest, we heard a piercing scream in the distance. It was distinct, unmistakably the cry of a mountain lion. If you've never heard one before, it's chilling. It resembles a terrified woman letting out a blood-curdling shriek. This was bad news. When mountain lions scream, it usually means one of two things: a mating call or a fight. Either way, hearing one meant there were multiple lions nearby. The black bears in the Pinecrest Range were mostly harmless, but mountain lions? They were a different story. They had been known to stalk hikers, attack cyclists, and kill pets. Even with 3 of us, we weren't completely safe if a hungry lion decided we looked like easy prey. Alex was visibly shaken. Where he was from, there weren't any predators like this, and the thought of a powerful wild animal possibly eyeing him as food was deeply unsettling. Mia and I were wary but not panicked. Growing up in the region, we were used to natural hazards, wildfires, earthquakes, snowstorms, and, of course, dangerous wildlife. We had encountered bears, snakes, and other creatures before. It was just part of being outdoors. This wasn't even the first time we'd heard mountain lions. We had even seen them before, though usually from the safety of a house or a car. Once, as kids, we'd set out an expensive steak in my backyard in hopes of luring a lion for a photo. It didn't work, and my mom was furious about the wasted meat. Anyway, Mia and I reassured Alex that we'd be fine, but that we should head back down. We quickly packed up our leftover food and started our descent. About 40 minutes in, Alex suddenly stopped in his tracks. He had left his phone back at the overlook in our rush to leave. "I can live without it," he muttered. "Alex, it has all of our spring break pictures. And you're a broke college student." "Yes, you need it back," Mia argued. After some back and forth, we made a decision. Mia and Alex would go retrieve the phone, and I would stay on the trail to warn any hikers coming up about the lions. I mostly worried about the ones with off-leash dogs, an easy target for a prowling predator. Sitting alone on a rock in the shade, I scrolled through the pictures on my phone and played a game to pass the time. There was no service, but I figured they wouldn't be gone long. After about 50 minutes, I heard the scream again. This time, it sounded closer. My nerves started to spike. Being alone in mountain lion territory was a terrible idea. My mind kept going over what I knew. If a lion was hunting me, I wouldn't hear it. They were silent killers. The screaming meant something else was happening, but that fact didn't make me feel any better. Another 20 minutes passed before the scream rang out again. No doubt about it, it was closer now. It came from the direction Mia and Alex were returning from. I stood up, feeling every hair on my arms rise. My gut screamed at me that something was very wrong. I scanned the woods, my phone's flashlight on despite the daylight, and moved to the center of the trail to have the best view of my surroundings. Then I saw it. About 20 feet up the trail, partially hidden by the trees, stood a man. He was completely naked and covered in filth, rail thin, and just standing there, staring at me. I hadn't heard him approach. It was as if he had just materialized. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe he was a lost hiker? It wasn't uncommon for people to get turned around in these woods, and it didn't take long without food and water for someone to become delirious. The infamous Donner Party disaster had taken place only about an hour away from where I stood. At first, I felt concerned. Maybe he was in trouble. People suffering from severe hypothermia sometimes strip off their clothes, though that didn't make sense in July. I took a cautious step toward him and asked if he was okay. That's when a wave of absolute dread hit me like a truck. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. My instincts screamed at me to run. He looked unnatural, off in some way I couldn't put into words. My breath hitched. Then he opened his mouth and let out a scream. Not a human scream. It was the same blood-curdling cry we had been hearing, the exact sound of a mountain lion. My stomach dropped. My body locked up as terror flooded my veins. Had we been hearing him the whole time? I screamed too, out of pure panic. I wanted to run, but I didn't dare turn my back to him. He suddenly snapped his mouth shut, turned on his heel, and bolted into the forest. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the trees. But the suffocating sense of wrongness still clung to me. My whole body was trembling. I thought about running down the trail to escape, but I forced myself to stay put. I needed Mia and Alex to get back, and thankfully, they arrived within 10 minutes. I shakily recounted what had happened, and we agreed to report it to the rangers as soon as we had cell service. Mia and I had seen strange things before, she more than me, but she went pale when I told her about the man. I guess they hadn't heard a thing on their way back. To this day, the memory unsettles me. Did I encounter a mentally unstable person who needed help? Or something far more sinister? Mia is convinced it was a skinwalker, an inhuman entity mimicking the call of a mountain lion to stalk us. I don't know what I believe, but whatever it was, I hope I never see anything like it again. Alright, let's get one thing clear. I've trekked through the Indigo Ranges before, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I went through on what was supposed to be a simple hike through its gorges. The day started out bright, the kind of morning Aussies love to brag about. That misty glow that gives the Indigo Ranges their name curled lazily around the cliffs like a dream. I set off from Belridge, eager for a full day of solitude and the eerie beauty of Hollow Gorge. Looking back, I should have turned around the moment I felt that uneasy tingle at the back of my neck. You know, the one you get when you feel like someone's watching you. But being the fearless guy I like to pretend I am, I brushed it off as just the mountain air playing tricks on me. Bad call. I missed the trail marker, distracted by the way the shadows flickered between the tall eucalypts. That's when I veered off course. The tracks in these parts twist and loop back on themselves like a coiled serpent. I've navigated them before, but today they had fangs and they bit down hard. Hours passed, and it dawned on me. I was completely lost. Night didn't just arrive. It crashed down like a heavy curtain, swift and merciless. I've never known darkness like that. Not the soft, distant glow kind you get in the city. This was a thick, suffocating blackness that settled into your bones. My phone's flashlight sliced through it like a candle in a storm, barely enough to see more than a few steps ahead. Every tree stretched its limbs like gnarled fingers, and every rustling bush whispered something I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Here's the part that still gives me chills. I wasn't alone. I never saw it outright, but in the slivers of fading twilight, I felt it. A presence just beyond my vision, radiating something cold and malicious. You've heard the old stories, right? The ones the elders mumble about over campfires? I used to laugh them off, but out here, laughter felt as useless as an umbrella in a hurricane. It was a hunt, and I was the prey. I stumbled over roots, my breath jagged, my pulse a frantic drumbeat. Then my phone beeped, low battery. Perfect timing, right? I gripped the device like it was some kind of lifeline, but even technology's comfort was slipping through my fingers. The night stretched on endlessly, my world reduced to the dim glow of my dying flashlight. Then, just as I was certain I wouldn't find my way out, the brush thinned, revealing an open dirt track. It was like an illusion. Relief flooded me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. It felt ridiculous, like something straight out of some twisted outback fairy tale. No golden pathway, but at that moment, I would have kissed the ground if I'd had the energy. I followed the road, my boots crunching against the dirt, and when I finally saw the silhouette of a ranger station against the breaking dawn, I could have wept. The ranger was an old-timer named Gary, the kind of man who's seen things and doesn't need to talk about them. He listened to my story with a slow nod, then offered me a ride back to my Uda. But every so often, I caught him checking the rearview mirror, like he half expected something to be following us. "Don't hike alone," he said finally, his voice nearly lost in the rumble of the engine. "Especially not when the mountains are restless." I haven't gone back since. People say it was just my imagination. Dehydration, panic, the wilderness playing tricks. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and my flat is still, I swear I can hear it. That same whisper of a presence. That same shiver crawling up my spine. Sydney's got plenty to explore without me chasing trouble. But if you ever find yourself in the Indigo Ranges, stick to the well-worn trails. And, for the love of all that's good, respect the signs, both the ones in the ground and the ones in your gut. And bring a damn good torch. Spending time deep in the wilderness has always been something I loved, and living in Alberta meant there were endless rugged landscapes to explore, along with the real danger of running into wild animals. One year, we set out on a particularly brutal trail in a remote part of Jasper National Park. The only way to get there was by boat, so we had to pay a guide to drop us off at the trailhead and just trust that he'd return on the agreed-upon day. No phone service, no roads, just raw, unforgiving backcountry. We were young and careless back in 2013 and didn't even think to bring a satellite phone. The trail itself was a disaster waiting to happen. Tons of risky crossings where you had to balance on fallen logs over steep drop-offs. But the real jolt of fear hit when we finally climbed above the tree-line and came face to face with a mother bear and her cubs. She immediately sent them scrambling up the only tree in sight, one of those tiny alpine saplings that wouldn't actually protect them. We knew running was a bad idea, but with her cubs behind her, she wasn't going to back down. So, in a moment of pure panic, we bolted. A dumb move, yeah, but somehow luck was on our side. She stayed put, guarding her cubs instead of chasing us down. That wasn't the only sketchy part of the trip. The trail stretched about 20 miles to the first campsite, and we spread out using whistles to keep track of each other. At one point, I found myself alone in a valley clearing, somewhere between my friends. The path was so overgrown that after stopping for a quick snack, I suddenly realized I wasn't entirely sure which direction was forward or backward. I blew my whistle, expecting to hear a response. Instead, I heard another whistle from my left, then another from the right. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't my friends. It was some kind of bird copying the sound. That's when it really hit me how easy it would be to wander off trail and disappear. Thankfully, one of my friends showed up soon after, and I stuck with him the rest of the way. As if that trip hadn't already been intense, we eventually crossed paths with the only other hikers on the trail, a group of 3 girls heading out. They looked shaken. When we asked what had happened, they told us that the night before, they were forced to camp right on the trail because it got too dark to reach the campsite. While they were setting up their tent, a wolf walked straight into their campsite. It didn't attack, but it also didn't leave right away. They only had an axe to defend themselves, and as they told their story, all I could think about was the fact that our group had nothing but bear spray and pocket knives. Sometimes I think about getting a gun for trips like that, but these days we're older and don't take as many risks as we used to. Looking back, I can't believe how unprepared we were, but somehow we made it out. That trip in Clearwater National Park is something I'll never forget. This was the 3rd eerie encounter I'd had in the past few years while exploring the public hunting grounds of southeastern New York. A few days back, I was hiking with my 2 dogs on some familiar paths, parts of which ran alongside the utility lines. I knew this area well, I had grown up just beyond them, but this time, I approached from a different direction than the one I used when I lived nearby. Most of the hike was ordinary until I turned onto an old, overgrown ATV trail leading to a deserted quarry. About 2 miles in, I noticed something odd. My dogs, usually eager to take the lead, were trailing behind me. It struck me as strange, but they were still sniffing around and darting in and out of the underbrush, so I brushed it off. Then, as I stepped into a small clearing at the top of the trail, I heard it, a faint voice. Help! I stopped dead, scanning the trees around me. My dogs stuck close but didn't react, not even a bark or a growl. That was odd. If there had been someone nearby, they would have sensed them before I did. I kept walking, my pace slower now, an uneasy feeling creeping over me. Then I heard it again. Turn back. That was all I needed to hear. Cold knot twisted in my stomach. My dogs, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly tensed, bodies low, ears twitching in every direction. Without hesitation, I turned around and started heading back the way we came, walking fast but staying composed. If it had been a real person, my dogs would have reacted differently. They always did. Given my past encounters in these woods, I have no doubt it was the mimic. I've run into it before, and the fact that this happened on my very first hike here in over a year, that's what unsettles me the most. The most intense thundersnow I ever encountered was while camping on Shadow Ridge in the Sawtooth Mountains. It started like any regular storm, but then, boom, a bolt of lightning ripped through the sky, so close I could smell the sharp tang of ozone. It was relentless, one strike after another, flickering so quickly it felt like someone had switched on a strobe light over the peaks. My wife and I huddled inside our tent, trying to keep as little contact with the ground as possible, bracing for the moment a bolt might find us. Then suddenly, everything lit up. For one terrifying second, we thought the forest was on fire, but no. In just half an hour, 4 inches of snow had fallen, and the storm wasn't done yet. Later on that same trip, during an unusually dry late summer stretch, we were pushing toward a high pass above the tree line when my wife spotted storm clouds rolling in. She panicked. Lightning up here with no cover, nowhere to take shelter. She pushed forward too fast, despite the blistering 95-degree heat. Her pack was heavier than mine, and she ran out of water. We passed dry creek beds, one after another, every single one marked blue on the map but bone dry in reality. Then she started swaying, lightheaded. A solid blue line on the map lay a mile ahead. I left her with our gear and sprinted ahead to find water. And I found it, a running stream. But as I crouched to scoop some up, movement caught my eye. A small brown head popped up across the water. Then another, a mother grizzly with her cubs. I was alone. No one had been on the trail for hours. My wife was a mile behind, too weak to help even if she could. I did everything right. Stood tall, made noise, waved my arms. She assessed me, calculating, and then she moved on. I didn't breathe again until she was gone. I forced myself to walk back to my wife, and once I was finally safe, once the adrenaline faded, I collapsed and cried. This was the best trip of my life. But every day, something out there tried to kill us. Thunder, snow, hypothermia, bears, hailstorms, dehydration. It's one thing to know what you should do in these situations, and another to stand there staring death in the face. Deep in central Alabama, there was an old, forgotten hunting camp that hadn't been touched in years. I don't believe in ghosts or legends, but this place had an eerie feeling that I couldn't ignore. The camp sat miles down a barely visible dirt path, completely enclosed by thick forest. It was, without a doubt, the most isolated spot I had ever been. I spent a lot of time hunting there by myself, but no matter how many times I returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. At the entrance to the property, there was a locked gate, yet somehow we'd often find the cabin's front door standing wide open, even though we knew for certain we had secured it. That was disturbing enough, but that wasn't the thing that finally drove me away for good. One evening, I was set up in a low clearing near a patch of crops we had planted along a narrow creek that marked the edge of the land. The second I sat down, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on why, but even with a .30-06 rifle loaded with high-velocity rounds in my hands, I didn't feel like the dominant hunter out there. The woods were full of life, birds chirping, squirrels rustling, the usual sounds of an Alabama dusk. Then, all at once, everything stopped. No birds, no insects, no movement. It was like the entire forest had frozen in place, staring at me. It was getting dark quickly, and that unnatural silence sent a chill through me. I decided to pack up and head back to the cabin. About 100 yards from my stand, that gut-wrenching feeling hit me. Something was right behind me. I spun around, rifle raised, aiming back toward the food plot. And that's when I saw it. Something stood in the middle of the trail. Not a person, not a deer. I could barely make out its outline in the dimming light, but it was tall, thin, and just wrong. It almost resembled some kind of upright animal, maybe a deer on two legs, but I had never seen anything like it before. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I didn't stick around to figure out what it was. I turned and ran straight for the cabin, grabbed my things, and got out of there. I never went back. I let the lease expire. Some things just aren't worth it.